Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, the Director of Professional Development for the Brown School, Washington University in St. Louis. So happy to have you all with us today as part of this conversation. For our friends joining us on Zoom, just want to remind you that you're muted. We can't see or hear you, nor can we call on raised hands, but we do want the audience to be a part of the conversation. So please do use the chat feature throughout the program today. For folks joining us on YouTube, we're really glad you're here. We don't have a way of including you directly in the conversation. Before we get started with this very special program today, I just want to give you an idea what's coming up in Open Classroom. We have actually 3 events next week. On Tuesday, Professor Mark Rank has a brand new book called Poorly Understood about understanding poverty in America. So we'll be doing that on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, we're kicking off our series about the COVID vaccine in St. Louis. Amazing panelists, including one of our panelists today is coming back to join us. And then on Thursday, we're kicking off a series related to policy, and some colleagues of ours from the Clark Fox Policy Institute are going to be talking to us about community organizing. I want to thank and acknowledge my friend and usual Open Classroom co-host, Cynthia Williams, who's going to be in the chat today helping to moderate. But we have a guest moderator today for this very special program. So let me introduce to you Tila Neguse, who is the Assistant Director for the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity here at Washington University. She's the center's Communication and Engagement Strategies Lead, previously been a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., working on federal budget issues and criminal justice reform. She's a community building strategist, policy analyst, and an activist, a perfect person to moderate today's conversation, Misogynoir, American Contempt Towards Black Women and How to Change It. Please welcome Tila.
Thank you, Janet. So hi, everyone. My name is Tila Neguse. And again, I just want to welcome you all to our discussion today, Misogynoir, American Contempt Towards Black Women and How to Change It. This partnership with the Brown School's Open Classroom is a part of the CRE2 Atelier program. And we're very happy that Misogynoir is going to be the topic of our first atelier. When we say ateliers, we imagine these as sort of workshops or studios that are non-credit bearing spaces designed to make new ideas, craft new meanings, and unpack and repurpose existing frameworks. So what is more fitted to do that than a discussion of Misogynoir? This Misogynoir atelier today will draw on the path-breaking framework developed by Professor Moya Bailey. What is misogynoir exactly? As Professor Bailey explains, misogynoir describes the anti-Black and misogynistic racism directed at Black women, particularly in visual and digital culture. The term is a combination of misogyny, the hatred of women, and noir, the French word for Black, which also has film and media connotations. Even if you're not familiar with this term specifically, the concept of the combination of racism and misogyny directed towards Black women is one that is super prevalent in our society. So prevalent that Professor Bailey had to create a new term for it, actually. In daily life, misogynoir comes in many forms, whether it be the perception that Black women have higher pain thresholds, therefore are treated differently by medical professionals, or when Black women are viewed as threatening or angry whenever they speak up for themselves. You know, there's tons of examples that I'm not going to go into right now because we have this amazing panel of Black women experts who are going to help us unpack misogynoir today. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. I'd like to first introduce Adrienne Davis. Adrienne Davis is the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and Diversity and the William M. Van Cleve Professor of Law. Adrienne is also the co-director for the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. Vice Provost Davis is a feminist and critical race theorist who focuses on the law of daily life, or how law regulates and affects people's daily interactions, decisions, and identities. She has written extensively on the gendered and private law dimensions of American slavery. She is currently working on several projects on the second generation of work on intersectionality, including misogynoir. She is the co-editor of the books Black Sexual Economies, Race and Sex in a Culture of Capital, and Privilege Revealed, How Invisible Preference Undermines America. Hedwig Lee is a professor in the Department of Sociology and the co-director of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. Professor Lee is broadly interested in the social determinants and consequences of population health and health disparities, with a particular focus on the role of structural racism in racial and ethnic health disparities. Her work examines the impact of family member incarceration on the health and attitudes of family members, the association between racialized chronic stress and mental physical health, the trends in racial and ethnic health disparities, and the role of histories of racial violence in the racial ethnic health disparities. As an interdisciplinary scholar, Professor Lee has published and worked with scholars across a wide range of fields. Dr. Matifadza Davis is the Associate Program Director, Fellowship Program in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Washington University School of Medicine. She is also faculty leadership at the Office of Inclusion and Diversity. Her research interests include delivery of care and retention of challenging populations with within HIV. She's also interested in the process of policy development and community engagement in the field of diversity and inclusion. Her expertise in the field of infectious diseases has been featured in many local and national news sources. Kinley Brown is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of African and African American Studies and a Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity postdoctoral affiliate. Kinley earned her PhD in African Diaspora and African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality. Her research interests and teaching agenda draws from her interdisciplinary training in Black intellectual thought and social science situated at the nexus of race, gender, and institutional violence. While at Berkeley, Kinley co-founded the Black Girlhood Imaginary Working Group and served as a project manager in the Justice Interaction Lab. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So I want to start off by posing a question to all of you. I just wonder, building on Moya Bailey's work, how would you define misogynoir? And Adrienne, we can start with you.
I was thinking we should start with our rising star, Kinley, if she's up for it.
Sounds good.
Yes, thank you, Adrienne. And thank you, Adrienne and Hetty, for inviting me to participate in this very important and urgent conversation. And I would also like to thank Tila and Janet and Sarah for organizing this panel. So Moya Bailey's work on misogynoir centers anti-Blackness historically to locate discrete ways in which hatred and violence are waged against Black women and girls. I then understand misogynoir as a call and response. It is a call back to the historical violences weaponized against Black people as commodities of flesh, denigrated for centuries. It is in this denigration where there is a specificity to the type of violence that inflicts and shapes the lives of Black girls and women today. Misogynoir exposes the current and deeply rooted conditions of an ostensibly post-racial society and colorblind world that overlooks systems of terror and violence that are very much intact and organize the lives of Black girls and women. To call on the specificity of violence then requires us to think and center the ways in which hatred is maintained and reproduced. It is in the ways that police officers were doing their jobs when they murdered Breonna Taylor. It is where the murders of 6 Black trans women in the span of 9 days in the summer of 2020 virtually went unnoticed and under-investigated. And it is where a security officer tackled a Black girl in high school, leaving her unconscious in Florida this past January. This is where we see the systemic ways in which violence is maintained and justified as a result of hatred towards Black women and girls. Thus, misogynoir requires a response that is transformative, that is a transformative intervention rooted in the tradition and valences of abolition. An abolitionist framework then requires us to deconstruct the institutional practices of violence, defund systemic terror, and doing away with ideologies of inferiority in order to respect the lives of Black women and girls and everyone's human dignity. I pass it on to Adrienne.
Hetty, do you want to go next? Mine is narrow, so I thought I'd start with the broader folks.
Sure. I mean, so Kinley, I really, your definition is really powerful. And when I think about it, when I think about this term too, I also think about other forms of structural violence, the ways in which Black women are often made to be invisible. And so we think a lot about these, sort of very direct forms of violence, police violence. Clearly we should be thinking about those kinds of things too, governmental agencies, but there's also the way in which Black women are systematically ignored in important policy discussions. So for example, in my work on criminal justice, I focus a lot on women who have family members or attached to individuals who are incarcerated. When we never talk about all the women who are holding down families, taking care of those families, making sure things are fine. When we think about police violence, we don't think about all the people who are witnesses to those police violence. So I think that when we're thinking about violence, that we need to be expansive and ensure that we think about sort of these other dimensions of structural violence that weigh down on Black women and also reflect contempt and just the sort of willful ignorance of the conditions that we have created because of structural violence and structural racism that have, really served to, impact Black women's everyday lives and constrain their, advancement in society. So I 100% agree with your definition. Just want to expand it to include these other sort of forms of structural violence that move beyond, thinking about these direct measures.
Mati, do you want to talk about it in your context, the definition?
I think we've really given an expansive definition, but I do think it's important to think about it in places that are thought of as places of privilege and that are supposed to be identified as safe spaces. So in medicine, I think of that both from the faculty and staff position in institutions that should otherwise be protecting them, growing them, and I go back to what Hetty just talked about by way of the idea of ignoring, but also in safe spaces that are supposed to be created for their benefit, for their healthcare, and how Black women experience that kind of violence within those places as well. So I'll be expanding on that later, but I think it's important for us to identify the fact that these are not only in traditional spaces that we think of them as.
Thank you, Mati. And the only thing that I'll add is that, excuse me, as a legal scholar, a lot of what I'm interested in is the set of systems, the infrastructure, the structures, the regulatory systems that reinforce misogynoir. If you look, I put into the chat the link to our Center's Atelier webpage, so you can click directly on that. It'll take you to a whole list of a syllabus, a bibliography, and some of the case studies that we're going to talk about in a broad definition, including Dr. Bailey's work. And part of her work is how prevalent misogynoir is in the media and in digital spaces. I'm really interested in the broad set of structures that regulate misogynoir and that sort of push Black women, regardless of class, regardless of orientation, into it. Now, of course, it always cashes out differently depending on broader intersectional identities that Black women hold, but it's something that no one can escape from, regardless of how much class status, how much straight privilege that you might have. And what I really want to reinforce is that it's not only the big constitutional systems that we talk about. It's not only, the Dred Scotts and the police violence. It's also what I call the law of everyday life. It's intergenerational transmission of wealth. It's the tort system. It's marriage. It's all of these things that come together. And that's a piece of what we're going to talk about. So it's this constant regulation of Black women by overt law, by culture, by discourse, by digital, by media. All of these systems come together.
Thank you. Kinley, I know you listed quite a few examples, but I was wondering if you all could share an example of misogynoir or case study from your particular fields.
Yes, absolutely. The fields in which I'm discussing this case study comes from Black studies and Black girlhood studies, specifically looking at the ways in which the erasure of childhood and its impossibility for Black girls was visualized in a violent encounter where a 9-year-old girl in Rochester, New York, was brutalized by police officers while she was suffering a mental health crisis. A mental health crisis that is waged within a global pandemic, and all the ways in which just not accessing school, peer relationships, restrictive access to food and shelter all compound that family life. And you see this in the form of a Black girl. And when the officers were called upon the scene for a family crisis, instead of providing medical and mental health assistance to the child, officers continuously threatened to pepper spray her and to handcuff her. At one point, one police officer tells the girl to, quote, "stop acting like a child." She retorts back, "I am a child," as he subsequently handcuffs her. As she's resisting being forced into the back of a police car and yelling for her father, one of the male officers pepper spray her in the eyes, and she subsequently screams, yelling, "My eyes are burning." Once they push her into the car, a female police officer then says to her, quote, "You did it to yourself," end quote. And the importance of this is the fact that this young girl was seen as uninjurable. What I mean by that is, once the video went viral, Mike Mazzeo, president of the Rochester Police Locust Club, the union representing police officers, told reporters, quote, "The officer made a decision that he thought was the best action to take. It resulted in no injury to her," end quote. Quote, had they had to go and push further, use more force, there's a good chance she could have been hurt worse," end quote. This is misogynoir. This is gaslighting. This is violently attacking a child who's denied their childhood in order to justify the violence of police officers in this family crisis. And even though the president of the union believes the girl was not injured, this injury she suffered reverberates through her body, her mind, her soul, a reverberation that will impact her family and her community, a reverberation that is embroiled in a prolonged and excruciating history and contemporary machination of violence and hatred deployed against Black women and girls.
Wow. Mati?
So the case that I will use is closer to home. I reflect on a Black woman living with HIV referred to my care a year ago. She came to me after 10 years of being bounced around from one system to another, unable to get her HIV care under control. She started off closed. She would not share too much with me. However, step by step, she started to share certain aspects of her life that had led to her being in my room at the chair in the chair that she was sitting. She talked about the death of her mother and the pain that caused in her life. She talked about the care of her 3 young children. She talked about how she was unable to get to many hospital visits. She talked about her struggle with anxiety and depression. She talked about how she had overcome a history of drug abuse 5 years prior to that. I then look at the other side of it. I look at myself, a faculty member, the only Black woman faculty member in the Division of Infectious Diseases, at the time pregnant, at the beginning of what we now know to be a worldwide pandemic, and only weeks away from Black Maternal Fetal Health Week, where I was being bombarded with statistics about the disproportionate death of Black women in contrast to white women when they were giving birth. This case is important for multiple reasons. 10 years of this woman's life, 10 years of her ability to thrive, 10 years of being ignored in a system that was designed to serve her, brought her to me in fulminant AIDS. The next few weeks were spent with us trying to save her life with what at that time were valiant but efforts that we were unable to get ahead of the overwhelming opportunistic infections that now had ravaged her body. 96 pounds, 3 children under the age of 10, and she subsequently died a week before I gave birth to my second daughter. 2 weeks after that, After breastfeeding my child at 2 a.m., I finally had the courage to watch the video of George Floyd being murdered in broad daylight. Our stories are interconnected. Her care dependent on me, her life impacting my health, my mental health, and my ability to take care of other patients, and my position in an institution in which I am tokenized, again, having an impact on her care and the care of other Black women I serve. Thank you.
Hi, Mati, I want to thank you for sharing that with us. And I also want to say to people that it's a different context, but it's an aligned context in which I think we find misogynoir in our efforts as professional Black women, that our efforts to actually do our jobs sort of invites misogynoir. And I wrote, actually with an Asian American male friend of mine, colleague of mine, we wrote an exchange of letters to each other maybe 10 years ago, 11 years ago, about what it was like in our generation being a Black woman law professor and Asian American man law professor, and sort of how today what I would call misogynoir. So if people want to take a look at that, it's in the syllabus that we've put into the chat. So Mati, my heart breaks that, you know, the things that happened to me when I was at your stage are still happening now. It shouldn't happen. So the case I want to talk about is literally a case, and it's in the syllabus on our webpage if people want to look at it. It is an 1828 Virginia case called Talbert versus Jenny. I cannot do justice to it in 2 minutes, but I'm just going to tell you very quickly that Jenny was an enslaved Black woman who was enslaved by a family that proclaimed to be, you know, very fond of her. And they were so fond of her that the patriarch of the family, Mr. Talbert, Daddy Talbert, said to her, Jenny, when you have had 5 children, one for each of my white children, then I'm going to free you. And he was, you know, seen as a very good slaveholder. And Jenny indeed did have 5 children. We don't know enough about Jenny's life to know whether that's why she had the children. But she had 5 children, and at that point he did treat her as free, and then she went on to have 3 more children. Daddy Talbert died at some point, and through a very complicated kind of lone lien, one of his sons said that Jenny and her 3 youngest children were not, that her 3 youngest children were not free, that they were still enslaved. It was a very complicated claim that he made. Jenny, he was happy to let go. He said, yep, you're old, you're not productive anymore, so I'm not making claim to you, but I am making claim to your 3 youngest children who I want to enslave, along with your 5 oldest children who have been distributed among me and my white siblings. So to me, this is literally a case study in misogynoir. It really points us to, you know, if you're a lawyer, you may have some sense, or if you're a historian, you may have some sense of just the really complicated, brutal, disgusting set of laws that would have regulated this system, the laws that said that the children of enslaved Black women would themselves be enslaved regardless of the status of the father, regardless of the race of the father, the set of rules that also dictated how manumissions and freeing slaves work, set of rules that said that rape was not a crime that was committed against Black women, not just enslaved women, but all Black women in many states. So Jenny is someone who found herself at the set of this very, very complex set of laws, right? And in my other work, I've called this set of laws a sexual economy of slavery. But here I want to really reinforce how they are emblematic of misogynoir. And what's really important here is that it would be easy to slip into saying, well, the system hated Jenny, these people hated Jenny. But as Cynthia Williams, who was our thought partner in putting this together, said hatred probably doesn't quite capture it, because they thought they were fond of her. You know, they thought they were freeing her. They thought she was a great slave and a great person, and they thought that they were being good to her. So hatred doesn't capture it. It's contempt, it's degradation, it's exploitation, it's predation. But it's all of that wrapped in an understanding, self-understanding of intimacy, fondness, and affection. And I want to reinforce that, because even though, you know, our lives are nothing like Jenny's, and it would be folly to suggest that they are. But misogynoir does, I think, suggest the through theme from slavery to today, which indicates that frequently people can treat Black women with contempt and predation and exploitation, even when their self-understanding is of affection and intimacy with us.
Tila, I guess I should go next. Yes, final. So you'll see a little bit that I also, like Kenley, provide 1,000. I feel like sadly too many case studies. Sure, the case study of Erica Garner, Melissa Harris Perry provides sort of a profile of Erica Garner. She died at the age of 27 of a heart attack. I was thinking about some of what Mati was discussing. She had a 4-month-old that she had named after her late father, Eric Garner, who was killed by a police chokehold. And I used her to profile or try to understand this concept because I think it reflects the invisibility of Black women, the way that we sort of ignore the pain and sorrow that they experience, especially because of acts of police violence, but other forms of violence that are enacted among Black men. Mati discussed this too in terms of having to deal with hearing about yet another Black man who died at the hands of the police. And Erica Garner, interestingly, at a very young age, at 23, after post her father's death, was organizing sit-ins, was a huge activist, got on the radar of many other important activists to try to bring attention to police violence, racial disparities in police violence, but in many ways was demonized and treated as an angry Black woman instead of a girl who was really young in her early 20s who just lost her father and was, taking care of 2 small kids, coming from a community that was dealing with the stressors of police violence on a day-to-day basis. I think she represents a lot of women. She represents people like Vanita Browder, whose son Khalif Browder also died in prison. There are just so many other Black women that I could have added to this list of case studies that sort of reflect all the burden that's placed on these women, the lack of attention, the ways in which women are hyper visible, but then also invisible at the same time. So we know Erica Garner, we know her as this person that's chanting in the streets, but we don't know her as a little girl who doesn't have her daddy anymore. As a woman who's dealing with the birth of a small child after a really traumatic event. And so that was the person that I profiled for my case study.
Tila, before we go ahead, can I just reflect briefly after Hedy, because I just gave my my case, but I just needed a second to collect myself. And just to highlight a few things that I think are important about why I chose to share that. The first is that a lot of times I think misogynoir is so destructive because we place these very comfortable labels upon the experiences of Black women, and in so doing are complicit in this invisible nature that we're talking about today. So for example, in the arena of medicine and public health, we're not comfortable with saying racism. We're more comfortable with saying implicit bias. We're more comfortable with terms that make that safe for the very people by whom we are suppressed and oppressed by. In public health, we talk about social determinants of health, a very safe grouping of terms that removes the accountability and the necessity behind moving forward the care, the access to care for Black women. I have cited several studies in the bibliography that we've provided for you about how Black women have consistently since the early 2000s not had equal access and equal outcomes in the arena of people living with HIV. And I challenge that goes beyond my area of medicine. And so in order to move past this and really address this, I think we also have to identify where the institutions that, again, are supposed to be safe spaces for both Black women faculty and our Black women patients, we are complicit in hiding these destructive and violent occurrences that ultimately led to my patient's demise and ultimately have made it so difficult for Black women to thrive in these spaces by removing this protective blanket and calling it what it is.
Thank you, Mati, and thank you so much for sharing those experiences. You're getting, the chat is going wild with thank yous for sharing and also praising what you have to say. I think, you know, calling it what it is so important. And it's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this discussion today, to name it specifically. Adrienne, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why we need this new term specifically, misogynoir. Like, why aren't the existing frameworks out there of racism and sexism enough? And why do we need to call misogynoir this specifically? How is it different from other terms? How is it different from intersectionality?
Thank you, Tila. And I would almost say that, you know, what Mati and Kenley are saying are almost case studies and why we need this term. So I think you, Tila, really adroitly characterized this as second generation intersectionality work. Intersectionality was a term coined by my senior brilliant colleague, Black feminist theorist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And what she was using Black women as an example of how people hold multiple identities, and that you can't understand people's experience along any single set of identities that might be meaningful or salient in the world. You have to understand how these identities interact, right? So her classic example was, you can't understand the experience of Black women by looking at the experience of Black men or of white women. You have to look specifically at the experience of Black women. And this has become one of the most profound, I think, frameworks and concepts invented by any legal scholar ever. And it's, you know, it's crossed over into every possible aspect of our lives. But I think often we misapprehend the power of Crenshaw's concept, because even though she used Black women as a classic example, everybody holds intersectionality. It's not only women of color who hold it. White men are intersectional, right? They are at an intersection of identities of race and gender, right? Black lesbians have intersectionality, right? Disabled people have intersectionality. So we've only begun to think about it. And also it's not only about subordination. People also have, you know, axes and identities of privilege as well. So the full power of intersectionality can help us understand almost anything that's happening, I think, in the world. Misogynoir, which is, I think, very much second generation, is inviting us to continue to look specifically, explicitly at what are the histories. I loved what you said, Kenley, about the commodifications of the flesh. What are the histories of violence, histories of commodification? What are the systems? What are the regulatory structures? And what, you know, to the point that Hedy and Mati make, what are the ongoing structures, right, that continue to shape the experience of Black women?
Thank you. So we had a conversation, Kritu had a conversation last night on Black boys' mental health, and it's really interesting having this conversation today juxtaposed against our conversation last night, which talked a lot about just mental health in young Black boys and men. And Kenley, I'm wondering, you know, you study girlhood, and I'm wondering if you can share how we should think about misogynoir and its relationship to Black young women and girls.
Yes, thank you for that question and the conversation around mental health. And also, Mati, to your important, powerful statement of these euphemisms are violent in of themselves. And I want to speak to that as well from my expertise in alternative education and discipline. And so many times when students in Northern California are encouraged to go to alternative schools, it's supposed to be for their betterment educationally, because they've fallen behind either in grades or might not graduate. But what I found is that there was a moniker used to describe the alternative school I conducted my research at. It was called literally a dumping ground, where they would describe young people being warehoused in this school until they could graduate. And so with that kind of moniker, a dumping ground, something that these students already know is circulated in conversations in the community, their teachers, their administrators, that already puts you as an excluded person, that already makes you feel a certain type of way. And it comes back to really studying how mental health emerges in this work. While it's not my area of expertise, I spoke with a young woman who I followed for 3 years in her life course. And she said, you know, all the times I ditched school and I was kind of absent, I was depressed. I had young women talk about the ways in which they were too depressed to even talk to their friends and would have to shut off. So many of these young women don't go outside, do not eat nutritionally, are eating Cheetos and green tea in cans, because literally the world is compounding on them because of all of the different type of responsibilities they had, and then also being repressed and unseen in their educational experiences. And so it's so important to understand that the ramifications of these violences, like you all have pointed out to today, is very much embroiled in the everyday ways in which this violence is seen, especially for young people. And so when we're looking at youth who are disproportionately punished in schools, we need to expansively think about what is punishment. It's not only getting suspended, expelled, or arrested. It's also being pushed out into another school site. It's also not being called upon. It's also not being able to get mental health and physical health resources at your school because they don't think anything's wrong with you. And then I want to end with also how mental health crises of how Black girls and boys engage one another. I had a young woman who was kicked out of her mom's home and went to the home of her boyfriend who was suffering from a recent diagnosis of bipolarism, but he did not have the insurance to go to therapy or get the adequate medications he needed. And so then you have in this situation, this young girl who is trying to find safety and space with her boyfriend, who's also dealing with his own crises, and then they exacerbated both of their mental health crises. And so the question is, who does this fall on with these issues that kids who will become adults are dealing with? And it makes me think about what I talked about of the call and response. What's our response? And so when I think about our response, I think about how can we create a world where Black girls can be safe and their loved ones and their kids can be safe, when you can embody and express yourself without the threat of your well-being attacked and violated. How can you be respected and honored as a human being, and valued as a person, to be heard, to be loved, and create community? And so I leave us and myself with the question of, as we talk about the specificity of contempt, hatred, and violence, what is our specificity of love and honor toward Black girl life in our own disciplines and our own passions and interests? Thank you.
Thank you, Kinley. And the next question I want to ask Hetty kind of addresses some of these issues of intersectionality, of mental health that you all have brought up, because we know that this term started in the humanities. But Hetty, I'm wondering, how do we make the insights of Misogynoir legible and relevant to social scientists and folks working in other disciplines?
Thanks, Tila. I think some of the discussion here has been so great and generative because it really suggests that we have to be interdisciplinary when we're thinking about these ideas. So as a sociologist, demographer / person who also studies population health, I think I definitely agree with Mati that there's a focus on, when we talk racism, it's often in passing. We don't directly model it. We are much more focused on things like implicit bias that are important, but do not talk about systems of racial violence, historical and contemporary or otherwise. And so I think first, having interdisciplinary conversations like the ones we're having are key for social scientists to even know and understand what they're measuring. Social scientists, I'm sure there's someone in the audience I think can easily adopt terms quickly, but I think you have to have a true understanding of what it means and understand it through reading work outside of one's own discipline and having these kinds of conversations. I also find it sometimes frustrating that we have to prove that a concept exists by measuring it and modeling it in an equation. I think that there's so many other ways to garner evidence about this concept, from case study work, from qualitative research, et cetera. So there's often a push to try to model things. So, and for example, as a demographer, people are really interested in modeling intersectionality. So they do things like, some of you might be familiar with these terms, interactions. In statistics, to try to interact, race and gender, to kind of show different levels of vulnerability to specific outcomes. And while I think that is interesting, it can often be reductive, and we lose insights like the ones that Adrienne talked about before, that intersectionality isn't just about race and gender, it's about race and gender and context, about race and gender in historical time, about race and gender and sexual identity, et cetera, et cetera. And we lose the ways in which privilege is amplified or vulnerability is amplified when we are reductive in our modeling. And so I don't know if I have an answer to the question, but I do think it's going to require, true interdisciplinary work, really reaching and reading those kinds of things, and also being open to the fact that not everything can be modeled in an equation, and that's okay. And that's fine. And also accepting that certain things are social facts. I think it is really frustrating to have to say that racism exists. It's really frustrating to say that contempt of Black women, I have to model that for you to believe that. I mean, I feel like there's so much evidence of that, in the media, not just in academic work. So I didn't answer your question, but those are my comments related to the question.
Oh, that works. That works. And then we're gonna, I see a lot of questions are coming in the chat, and we're gonna open up for Q&A soon. But Mati, I want to invite you, if you'd like to share more about how misogynoir translates from the experience of physicians in academia to the patients they serve.
Yeah, I'd call people to take a look at Uche Blackstock's article that she released last year after she left academia and is now a prominent spokesperson in the field of health equity. But she left a prominent academic institution due to her misogynoir experiences. And what I would say is that I think it's important for institutions to understand that there is a direct link between the health, wellness, and academic success of Black people in general, but Black women specifically, that translates to the care that they serve. In Uche's case, she talks about in her article how painful and destructive it was once she left for the Black mentees that she was responsible for whom she was the only person they felt they had in her institution. How destructive and painful it was for the many Black patients for whom she was the first and only physician that they had that she could identify with. And I felt that from a very personal space in the case that I gave you, but many other cases that I'm directly involved with right now. And so it's understanding that the interventions, because there's been a lot of interventions proposed within the last year, especially in response to last summer, have to be more than just at the patient level or the sort of superficial responses. The work that Dr. Adrienne Davis is doing right here and convening us in advocating for this center speaks more and helps more and does more to further policy change and direct interventions that then directly benefit the Black women faculty and expands out to the care of people living with HIV. On the patient side, however, we have to start addressing the barriers to care and also the ways that we inflict violence upon our patients. And let me give a direct example. Specifically, we put in our chart labels that cause our patients to not benefit from the full access of care. We call them drug addicts. We label them as Black, knowing full well that that will impact their care. We talk about how they are difficult, and we copy and paste forward notes without directly even thinking about how that will impact our patients. That alone as an intervention would have such big benefits, on top of the fact that we still need to address social determinants of health, make sure that we have adequate resources for transport, for nutrition, for insurance, and that type of support. And we know this can happen through case management, through peer support. But again, none of this happens in a vacuum. This has to be systemic, institutional, and federal change at the highest levels of leadership.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for sharing. This has been a really powerful conversation. Can't believe we only have an hour, but just thank you all. And we're gonna do Q&A now. We have one question that came in from Bob Fox, and I'll just pose the question, and whoever feels moved to respond, please go ahead. What has the concept of male dominance, including among Black men, played in promoting these attitudes towards Black women?
I can go ahead. So I think, sorry, that's a great question. Bob Fox always has really great questions. And so I think it's a pretty big question. So one thing that I will say, and this is, so I'm going to comment on one part of the question and then others can comment on the other part of the question, but this idea about Black male dominance is, I often find, especially in my work on women who are connected to incarcerated family members, that sort of part of the, it's part of this contempt and invisibility is also amplified by the contempt and invisibility we have for Black men as well. And not that, patriarchy is everywhere and it manifests within races. So I'm not trying to discount patriarchy, which I think is important to understand in this concept, but the ways in which we demonize Black men infiltrates how we think about Black women, and often also leads to the ways in which we punish them for different kinds of things. So for example, oftentimes Black women who have incarcerated family members are ignored. They are punished because they are seen as responsible for the outcomes of Black men, but also that it is their own doing that they are romantically involved with somebody who is bad. But again, these are stereotypes that we are inputting men that are also problematic and unfair and untrue. And as Tila mentioned, Kevin Simon's talk on Black men's mental health suggests that there's so much that happens even from preschool that demonizes Black boys, that makes them seem like they're problematic. And then those stereotypes are then imbued upon Black women in these really interesting ways that can further demonize them, treat them as victims of Black men when they're not victims of Black men, they're victims of violence and racism. And so while I think it's important, and I hope other people can answer the patriarchy part of this question, because I think it's great, I really get uncomfortable when we talk about Black men in terms of in opposition to Black women. I think there are important conversations to be had there, but oftentimes it comes from the same kinds of discussions about racism that have led to why we have this concept for women too.
And I can add to that. I agree with everything that Hetty said. The Black feminist theorist Barbara Omalati gave a really, really intriguing description of American slavery. And she said that under typical worldwide, patriarchy, kind of across the globe, you find that groups of men will dominate, groups of women, their own quote unquote groups of women. And that slavery was this instance, right, where white men broke any solidarity with Black men and decided they were going to dominate all of the women. And I think Hetty's insight is really important, because I think part of what Misogynoir captures, right, I don't want to say that hijack in any way the studies of Black masculinity, which stand alone and are so important, but I think part of what Misogynoir captures is how it's not only Black women who are intersectionally discriminated against, the contempt against us preyed upon because of our race and gender. It is also Black men, right? That because of the intersection of their race and gender, we probably need a term to capture it like Misogynoir for them, they are also treated and marginalized on the basis of their race and gender. So as Hetty said, we're not in opposition at all. We are, Black men. And I wrote an early article on this about how if you think about slavery, you can think about it in some ways as the root of sexual harassment in the world. It's a system in which, enslaved people are workers, and sexual abuse of enslaved women and enslaved men, but especially of enslaved women, is part of trying to break the back of that workforce. Enslaved Black men were some of the earliest allies against structural sexism in the world, because they saw what was happening to enslaved Black women and they stood up for us. And all you have to do is read Frederick Douglass's essays on this to see that.
Mati or Kinley, do you have anything to add?
The one thing I would add, because I feel like Adrienne and Hetty did an amazing job covering that question, is also introducing the work of Nikki Jones in her newest book, The Chosen Ones. And she has a brief article called Gender Violence in Cocoon Journal, where she talks about how violence moves through state violence into our communities and onto each other, that then create this conflict, right? This violent conflict between Black men and women. And so when we look at state violence and how Black male bodies are violated, both sexually and physically, by police officers, law enforcement, et cetera, that then moves and structures how then they reassert their power within dynamics of their community members. And it's not only just Black men who are suffering from this violence as well, right? It's on the spectrum of identities and sexuality. And so it's important to note just the movement of violence and how our introduction to this country as enslaved people was through a violent system. And so that violence then permeates and creates so much conflict. And just to echo the point of, we will not get free if not all of us are free. So I can't just say I'm riding for Black women being free. No, I ride for all of us to be free. We're all free globally. We can be free. And so I do just want to echo that work of Nikki Jones, The Chosen Ones. She does an amazing job synthesizing those complex dynamics.
Kenley, is that different than the gender of police violence piece?
No, it's the same one. Thank you.
Okay, cool. No, because I put it in the chat. I put it in the chat, so I wanted to make sure I got the right one in the chat. And a lot of what we're referring to again is on our syllabus on our webpage.
Our next question comes from Daryl Hudson. Daryl asks, how can we disrupt the broad cultural norms and stereotypes that have dehumanized Black women for so long? Whose responsibility is this disruption?
I'll start with a small example, and then I will let the people in the bigger domains. Well, okay, so here's a small example and a bigger example from law, right? So, obviously the laws that we have need to be enforced. They need to be enforced in ways that are gender and racial equitable, right? We need that to be the case, and that includes, holding police accountable for pepper spraying 9-year-olds and telling them not to act like children. I mean, they are children. And, there are laws that we have in place that people are trying to roll back, and we need to fight to keep them. And we probably need some new ones as well. The smaller example I'm going to give, because I think frequently people get overwhelmed. It's like, what can I do to fight back against, centuries of misogynoir and racism and sexism? And it's a lot. And I would say, as an individual, you can read, you can learn, you can fight for justice. And I'd also say, be like Joe Biden, right? So, Joe Biden is like, hey, I get to kind of, there's a possibility I get to pick the next president of the United States, right? I could pick anybody I want. I'm going to pick, a woman of color. I'm going to pick a woman who identifies as Black and South Asian. And, who knows if she'll become the next president or not, right? But he took that power that he had and he used it to empower a woman of color. And I think so often when people are wringing their hands, and I understand structures are really, really hard to navigate, but think about whatever power you do have in your little domain, whatever your domain might be. It could be your homeowners association, your school board, whatever in your neighborhood. Think about what that power is. And if there isn't someone, a Black woman somewhere that you can empower, be an upstander for in some way.
Would anybody else like to respond?
I would say we all have responsibility to disrupt, but we also have different levels of accountability and responsibility and impact. And so I know folks are really excited to say, Stacey Abrams saved Georgia. Stacey Abrams should not be saving Georgia. Georgia, the United States, needs to be saving all of us. And so it's really recognizing your own power, your own privileges, and what you can do to change the very much embedded and ingrained, unconscious at times, events and moments of violence. And just think about yourselves and your workplace and your homes and your families and your friendships. Think about the ways in which you can disrupt that. And as we build this consciousness, it can move through structurally, communally, and interpersonally. So I will say we can all do our part, but there definitely are different levels of responsibility and accountability.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to add really quickly for another, this wasn't on, actually, I think I have it on the syllabus too, is read some Audre Lorde. I think Audre Lorde also really talks about this, like how do we garner power from each other? Where can we disrupt systems from the smallest levels to the highest levels? I saw in the chat, I don't know if you saw this, Tila, somebody was discussing, the chasm between white and Black women. I think Audre Lorde also talked about that too. thinking, is that where you're going to ask about that next? Did I mess up? Okay, well, we can finish talking about, but I think she talks a lot about how do we build community to understand our privilege, and where we're privileged and where we're not, and how we can work through and dismantle systems. So definitely, as Adrienne says, when you're reading, definitely read some Audre Lorde, and she is on the syllabus.
And I would add to that Bell Hook's early work too, where she's really trying to come up with, a theory of Black feminism, and that's on the syllabus too.
So we had two questions that I'm just going to kind of combine them. Hetty, like you said, you gave a little preview. So someone asked, can you all comment about the racist view that they've observed amongst white people viewing Black women as too loud, forceful, opinionated. And then someone else asked, can you all address the gender issue in that white women face some of the same issues as Black women, yet there's a big chasm between the two, which I think we've already started to get the ball rolling, talking about Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde with this discussion. So.
I would love to hear what you have to say, Mati, but one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about being a faculty member is the ways in which these stereotypes impact the everyday, and Adrienne, you talked about this too in terms of the everydayness of the law, but these everyday violences. And I was just thinking about being an assistant professor at a previous university and faculty meetings, and really being very careful about the way that I reacted to different discussions and when we were talking about things in faculty meetings, because I felt that pressure that if I reacted a specific way, that it would reinforce, particular ideas about me being a Black woman and how I, like my demeanor about, something that, is particular. Like, I mean, I don't want to, just because people can look at my syllabus or my CV and know where I came from, but everybody's had, for those of us who've been in faculty meetings, like people make mistakes. There's always sometimes comments that come up that are can be racially charged, how do you navigate that? And it was such a stress. There's just this chronic burden of having to deal with that. And so Tila, I'm not really answering your question, but I think, again, I really like Audre Lorde because I feel like, there are ways in which we can also talk about being women faculty and the ways in which there are very gendered experiences, but there are also really specific ways about being a Black woman that are particularly painful and hard. Not in my department, but I've had people, confuse me with other faculty members across the country, being at academic conferences and somebody shouting my name or not my name because I'm somebody else. Those kinds of things. I'm not saying they don't happen to people who are not Black women, but those kind of everyday assaults that you just have to keep smiling and not say anything, it's really hard. And it does take a toll on your body. I mean, there's research that shows that Daryl Hudson asked a question. I know his research shows this kind of stuff. And so while I think we need to be thinking about ways in which, gender does, subsume a lot of our issues, I get scared, I guess, from what Monty said too, that sometimes then we lose this race gender intersection that is super important and different at all levels of, society, no matter where you work, live, learn, work, or play, right? So that's just my comment, not answer, Tila, usually, but comment.
Thank you, Hetty. I think that we could all sit here, and people in the audience too could share story after story after story. And I guess for me, it becomes about when do they stop becoming stories and start becoming a part of systemic change. I do think that the intersectionality that Adrienne kept speaking to makes it complicated to address, because I can talk about times where my intersectionality as a woman, a Black woman, and then a Black Zimbabwean woman gave levels to how this has occurred for me throughout my time in academics. But one thing that came to mind was the idea of allyship and how that became a particularly important part of the conversation last year. And I think about, when we talk about our white counterparts and how they may want to process this information today and move forward, is what I saw a lot of was this passive and therefore, to me, useless idea of allyship versus the more uncomfortable and difficult idea of it, And we talk about upstanding and all of these different things. So I think about times when I was a fellow and had even less comfort speaking up. And this is extraordinarily difficult even now, right? You don't feel as secure. And my security blanket comes from the woman in the right-hand corner, Adrienne, right? To even be able to speak in this way is, you know, when I got the call after bringing up an issue in our, you know, at an earlier time in my training about, was I okay? Was everything okay with the baby? And that's why I spoke up a certain way. Or, you know, as a Black woman, you know, because your tone being referenced. As a Zimbabwean, I've shared the story with Adrienne before of, you know, someone asking me if I had pet lions and swung from trees. And so the idea of where are you when these violent assaults are occurring to people who are not empowered yet. And even as a junior faculty member, I would argue I may not be empowered, but especially at a student level and below, where are you then? And challenge your idea of allyship, or quit using the term altogether. Stop using that badge with honor, because there is no honor. Let me say again, there is no honor in standing by and allowing these violence occurrences to happen and be perpetuated within our halls.
And I know we're at time, but I'll just add to that. I'm working on an article now about some of this, and you know, I'm delving into some of the, you know, the statistics from the last election, which, you know, aren't verified yet. But, you know, from what we can tell, it's still close to half of, you know, white women who voted for Donald Trump. And it's a complicated thing, and there's a lot of different forces at work. But when you contrast that with, I think it was either 92 or 94% of Black women who voted Democratic, I think it just shows you the divergence there in worldview, in preferences, how things shake out politically. It's just really, 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 really different. I think a lot of it it's about people's relationships to racialized patriarchy and to white patriarchy in particular. But I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of us. Part of what I noted is that a lot of my friends who are white feminists were appalled and horrified, and I think a lot of my Black feminist friends we were kind of disgusted, but we were more cynical about it. We're like, yeah, we knew that this was going to happen. So I don't feel like a lot of Black women feel like we can count on white women consistently as allies and upstanders to help us disrupt misogynoir. I think history has shown that, obviously, but even in today's world, I think that there's a lot of skepticism.
And Kinley, would you like to add any comment before we close?
No, y'all are great.
So again, I want to thank everyone on the panel for participating. This was a very wonderful discussion. I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us. The chat is full of affirmations as well. And thank you. And I encourage you to please visit the link that we dropped in the chat with the syllabus and resources that we referred to throughout the talk today. So thank you.